There's a particular kind of shame that only shows up during your teenage years. The shame of being seen in public with someone you actually love. Today's story is about a boy who felt that exact shame for nearly 3 years, and the father who never once let him know he'd noticed. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. On this channel, we tell honest stories about pride, family, and the kind of quiet love we sometimes take far too long to recognize. This particular story may change the way you see the people around you who work with their hands. His name was Ethan Walsh, and it began not with an argument, but with silence. The specific kind of silence that grows inside a 16-year-old's chest once he starts noticing what everyone else seems to notice. Ethan's father, Robert Walsh, worked as a garbage collector for the city. Every single morning at 4:30, Robert pulled on the same faded orange vest, climbed onto the back of the same rattling truck, and spent 8 hours doing a job most people drive past without a second glance, unless the smell reaches them first, followed almost immediately by a wrinkled nose or a muttered comment under someone's breath. For most of Ethan's early childhood, none of this registered as anything unusual. His father taught him to ride a bicycle in the parking lot behind their apartment. He showed up to every single Little League game, still faintly smelling of the morning route. He never once complained about the punishing hours, the heavy lifting, or the way his knees throbbed by 9 every evening. Then Ethan turned 14 and transferred into a new high school, one filled with classmates whose parents were surgeons, attorneys, and business owners. That's precisely when the noticing began. A classmate casually asked what his father did for work. Ethan mumbled something vague about city services and quickly steered the conversation elsewhere. Nobody pressed further, but the seed had already been planted. By 15, Ethan had perfected an entire system of avoidance, timing his walk to school so their paths would never cross his father's usual route, inventing excuses whenever friends suggested coming over before noon, forcing a laugh at jokes about trash men so nobody would suspect how close to home they landed. Here's the uncomfortable truth this story requires telling honestly. Ethan wasn't a cruel kid. He never intended to wound his father. He was simply drowning in something countless teenagers drowned in, without ever saying it out loud. The fear of appearing lesser than everyone surrounding them. Shame rarely begins with malice. It begins with comparison. And comparison, left to fester unchecked in a teenager's mind, eventually starts resembling cruelty, even when that was never the original intention. There was a classmate named Grant, whose father owned a chain of dental offices across the county. Grant liked to joke about the smell of garbage trucks whenever one passed the bus stop, never realizing, or perhaps never caring, that Ethan's ears burned every single time. Once, Grant asked outright, "What does your dad even do, anyway?" Ethan shrugged and mumbled something about city work, then quickly changed the subject before anyone could ask a follow-up question. It wasn't really Grant's careless joke that stayed with him. It was the fact that, somewhere underneath the shrug, 15-year-old Ethan genuinely didn't know how to answer the question with any pride. The breaking point arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday in October, midway through Ethan's junior year. He was walking home from school alongside 3 friends, Marcus, Jordan, and Priya, laughing about something forgettable, when he spotted a familiar orange vest half a block ahead, hauling trash bins along the curb through the downpour. His stomach dropped instantly. He said nothing. He simply crossed the street. Not casually, not by coincidence. Obviously, deliberately, tugging his friends along with a fabricated excuse about a shortcut. From the opposite curb, he watched his father glance up for just a moment and see him. Watched him walk right past. Watched him choose the other side of the road entirely. Robert didn't call out. He didn't wave. He simply kept working, rain soaking straight through his vest, silently watching his own son disappear around the corner, alongside people who didn't know, and were never meant to know, whose father stood 20 feet behind them. That evening, Robert arrived home late, exactly as usual. He never brought up what happened. He never did. He set his keys on the counter, kissed Ethan's mother on the cheek, and asked his son the same question he asked every single night, without exception. "How was your day?" Ethan mumbled, "Fine," and retreated to his room, unable to meet his father's eyes. Here's a sentence worth pausing on. It was never the job itself that diminished Robert. It was the silence, wrapped tightly around it. And that particular silence belonged entirely to Ethan, not his father. If you're still following along, don't spend this story simply pitying Ethan. Ask yourself something instead. Is there anyone in your life whose work you've quietly downplayed, edited, or softened, just so it might sound a little more impressive to a stranger? For 2 additional years, this exact pattern repeated. Ethan grew increasingly skilled at avoidance. On his college application, he described his father as working in municipal sanitation services. Technically accurate, deliberately vague. He never allowed friends over, before 7 in the morning or after 4 in the afternoon, the hours his father's uniform might still be visible. He flinched internally at every joke, and never, not a single time, spoke up and said, "Actually, that's my dad's job, and he happens to be the hardest working man I know." Robert never once questioned why his son had grown so distant. He simply kept showing up regardless. He never missed a single parent-teacher conference, even when it meant trading shifts with exhausted coworkers and sacrificing sleep before his brutal 4:30 start. He never stopped tucking $20 into Ethan's jacket pocket, just in case, even during weeks when their own family budget was stretched painfully thin. Robert's love carried no conditions whatsoever. It never demanded acknowledgement. It simply kept arriving, quietly and exhaustedly, day after day after day. Everything changed during Ethan's senior year. At an assembly nobody expected would matter much at all. The city was hosting a small ceremony, honoring essential workers who had kept the community functioning through a brutal winter storm that had shut down half the roads for nearly an entire week. Robert's name was announced among a handful of sanitation workers who had shown up anyway, clearing routes before dawn so ambulances and emergency vehicles could pass through, pulling double shifts in freezing temperatures without a single complaint. Ethan's school, coincidentally, was one of several invited to send students as part of a civics assignment. He had no idea his father would be there. He sat in the 3rd row of folding chairs, distracted, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone, until a name cut through the noise. Robert Walsh. He glanced up just in time to watch his father walk toward the small stage in a uniform that had obviously been carefully ironed for the occasion, gripping a modest plaque with both hands as though it might slip free if he loosened his grip even slightly. The mayor spoke briefly about dedication and quiet community service. The room applauded warmly. And for the first time in 3 long years, Ethan finally saw his father the way complete strangers saw him, not as some embarrassment worth avoiding, but as a man who had shown up, day after brutal day, in conditions most people would refuse to endure, for a community that barely acknowledged his existence, including, until that very moment, his own son. Something inside Ethan's chest cracked wide open. Every street he'd crossed flashed through his mind. Every excuse he'd invented. Every joke he'd allowed to slide by without ever defending the one man who had never once let him down. He didn't cry inside that auditorium. He waited until he arrived home, sat down outside his father's bedroom door, and knocked, for the first time, in what felt like years. Not because he needed anything from him, but simply because he needed to talk. Robert opened the door in an old, faded t-shirt, visibly surprised. Everything all right? Ethan struggled to find the words at first. I saw the ceremony today. I had no idea they were honoring you. Robert brushed it off immediately, the way he brushed off most praise. It's really not a big deal. Just doing the job they pay me for. It is a big deal, Ethan insisted, his voice cracking under the weight of it. Dad, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for crossing that street. I'm sorry for never once telling anyone what you actually do for a living. I was ashamed, and I shouldn't have been, and I honestly don't know how to take any of it back now. Robert stayed quiet for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed softly and pulled his son into a tight hug. I already knew, he admitted. I saw you cross that street that day. I've known for a while now, son. Ethan pulled back, genuinely stunned. Then why didn't you ever say something? Because you were 16, scared, and still trying to figure out exactly who you wanted to become, Robert explained gently. I wasn't about to make you carry my job as your personal shame on top of everything else a teenager already has to carry. I figured you'd eventually come around on your own timeline. I just never expected it would take an entire ceremony to get you there. Ethan sat down at the edge of his father's bed, something he hadn't done since he was a small child. Can I ask you something? Did it hurt, watching me cross that street? Robert considered the question honestly before answering. Every time, he said. But I told myself you'd figure it out eventually, the same way I had to figure out plenty of things on my own. Some lessons a father can't rush. He can only wait for them, and keep showing up in the meantime. That single conversation didn't erase 3 years of quiet avoidance overnight, but it planted something new. From that point forward, Ethan slowly began accompanying his father on lighter Saturday morning routes, simply to talk. He stopped deflecting whenever classmates asked about his father's job. Instead, he began answering plainly and without hesitation. My dad works in sanitation. He's covered every single holiday shift for the past 15 years, so our family could still have a decent Christmas. He watched, sometimes with quiet pride and sometimes with a lingering ache of guilt he was still working through, as people's reactions gradually shifted from awkward silence into genuine respect once they saw exactly how Ethan himself spoke about it, openly, without a trace of hesitation or apology. When the time finally came to write his college application essay, Ethan skipped past leadership camps and athletic trophies entirely. He wrote about his father instead, the faded orange vest, the relentless 4:30 alarm, the $20 bill tucked quietly into his jacket pocket, the street he had once deliberately crossed to avoid being seen together. He wrote honestly about shame, and about how effortlessly it can live inside an otherwise good person without them ever realizing exactly what it's silently costing the people they claim to love most. He was accepted into his first-choice university, but what mattered infinitely more was the evening he showed his father the finished essay before submitting it, watching Robert read through it twice in complete silence, before carefully folding the pages and saying quietly, "You really didn't have to write about me." "I wanted to," Ethan replied. "You earned every word of it. I just took far too long to actually see that clearly." Today, years later, Ethan proudly brings his father along whenever the subject of his own career surfaces in interviews or conversations with new colleagues. He never once omits what his father does for a living. If anything, he leads with it deliberately, as a quiet act of correction for every single street he once chose to cross. So here's something worth genuinely sitting with tonight. Is there someone in your own life whose work, whose daily struggle, whose quiet sacrifice you've ever felt secretly embarrassed by, even briefly? A parent with permanently calloused hands, an accent that draws unwanted stares in public, A job title that earns smirks from people who've genuinely never worked half as hard in their entire lives? Shame like this is learned behavior. It gets absorbed slowly through comparison, offhand comments, and a broader culture that quietly ranks certain forms of honest labor as somehow less deserving of respect than others. Nobody is born believing that one job matters more than another. That belief gets taught, repeated, and reinforced until it feels like common sense instead of what it actually is, a quiet, inherited prejudice. But it can also be deliberately unlearned, exactly the way Ethan managed to unlearn it. One honest conversation and one Saturday morning walk at a time. If any part of this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone whose parents genuinely deserve to hear a heartfelt thank you today. And if you've ever crossed a street, dodged a question, or stayed silent when you should have spoken up loudly for someone who worked themselves to exhaustion for your sake, understand this clearly. It is never too late to walk directly back across. Tell us in the comments below, what's one thing your own parents sacrificed that you didn't fully appreciate until years later? Somewhere tonight, another father is coming home late in a uniform nobody applauds, and another teenager is crossing a street without fully understanding what that choice costs. Their story isn't finished yet. Maybe, in some quiet way, yours isn't either. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.